So this is a workshop in Chennai Storytelling Festival 2021, and we're very honored and lucky to have David Newman here from Sydney, who is going to lead a workshop, introductory workshop in narrative therapy. So David, please introduce yourself, and you direct a center in Sydney, I believe, yes?
Yeah, so I've got a just an independent therapy practice.
Okay, so anyway, please take the floor and conduct your workshop.
Okay. And it sounds like I initially would like to, I need to actually acknowledge all the work that you're doing, Eric. So terrific for everything you've done and the endless emails and organizing and now hours of these workshops. But thank you for the introduction. All right, folks. So I hope that you've had interesting times so far. I'm in a moment I will just flick over to the PowerPoint, and I thought we could just go through it and stop and consider different things that we're looking at. So that's my plan to kind of go through a PowerPoint. But it's very lovely to be here with you all and on this wonderful theme of storytelling and really putting in the center of things stories or narratives. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge what we do in Australia when we have events like this. Because Australia is a colonized country, we do acknowledge the First Nations people of any area. If a First Nations person is present, they will welcome people to country. If a First Nations person is present who is from the country that we're meeting on, they will do a welcome to country as a person who is a custodian of the land. But I want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people. As Eric was saying, this is in Sydney, it's just slightly in the inner west, a little bit away from the coast. We have summer, and this is a very warm summer's day that we have here. And I know we've got all sorts of different weather conditions that people are presumably in, because this is a whole very international audience here. So, all right, so I'm just going to pull up the PowerPoint and then we'll get started. So folks, I thought what I thought we could do is kind of look at narrative therapy a little bit, but in particular, I plan on looking at the metaphor of story, and I plan on looking at where people's preferred storylines can start. That will be the focus of my talk. I'll tell some stories of therapeutic practice. I'll share some therapeutic documents, a therapeutic letter and a therapeutic collective document, as they're known in narrative therapy. And part of the work, part of the work will be the work that I've done in a psychiatric unit with young people here in Sydney. Okay, so what I intend is, if you also have questions or you'd really like something, you'd like to kind of hover around a particular theme or a point, I'm very, very happy to do that. Okay, so please interrupt at times. I do have some ideas for talking points as well. All right. So this is what I intend to do. So looking fairly briefly at narrative therapy, what's kind of meant by narrative therapy and the narrative metaphor. Looking at this principle in narrative practice, sometimes it's called narrative therapy, sometimes it's called narrative practice, that no one is a passive recipient of hardship. Okay, so this idea is that we're always responding to whatever life's circumstances are. And in those responses, we can build stories. We can build stories that people prefer. Often when we meet with people, if we're therapists or even if we're neighbours or family members, people might say things they really are finding hard about life. We could call that in narrative therapy the dominant or the problem story. It might be despair, it might be anxiety, it might be alcohol. Where I work with young people, it's often things like cutting or suicidal thoughts, panic, anorexia, all of these big themes that people are bringing to the conversations. And narrative therapy, we always assume there's more than one story. And one of the ways we can get onto those other stories, the preferred stories of people's lives, is just by noticing how people are responding, even if they think they're doing nothing, and the abuse has been terrible and they've done nothing, or the despair is just overwhelming. We're always interested in how people are responding. I will share with you a couple of examples of that. Now, when people I might speak a little bit about this later, but I'll just say briefly here. I was running a group not long ago, and someone said to me, David, I know how I deal with my depression. And I said, Marianne, how do you deal with your depression? How do you respond to this, what we might call a dominant story? And she said, I get out of the house every day and I find a dog to pat. That's the way she was responding to despair. Now, firstly, in narrative practice, they're the kinds of stories, or they're the kinds of actions we're really interested in. We're interested in the idiosyncratic and the local and the particular ways that people deal with things. We're not so much interested in bringing in particular ideas that they should do mindfulness or anything. Not that I'm against mindfulness, but we're interested in hearing what people are doing. But often what people are doing are very thin. So one of the ways that we can make these stories light up so that people can use them and they start to overshadow the problem story is we can have a conversation, but we can also use the written word. We can use therapeutic documents, and I'm just going to share with you a couple of examples of that. Okay, so I hope that's okay, and we'll see how we go with timing and your interests. Am I coming across okay? I don't see all of you, but you're understanding my accent okay, and the pace is okay. It's all right. 2 thumbs up. That's all right. My son once gave me a card on Father's Day a couple of years back, and he says, "You're a 2 thumbs up kind of dad." And I like it was one of the best cards I think I've ever had. Okay, so these are some of the key assumptions of narrative practice. The first one is people's identities and therefore their actions are shaped by stories that they tell and that get told about them. Okay, so look, there's a fair history to this. Probably a lot of you may, not assume everyone is aware of something called cognitive behavioral therapy, like cognitive therapy, and this was a particular that has a history that's got similar roots to narrative therapy. So, so one of the things about it is that we try and make sense of things. We are meaning makers, us human beings. We're really grappling with things. From an early age, we're grappling with things. Now, what is the premise of narrative practice? In order to grapple with something, in order to make meaning of things, one requires a lens. And that lens through which we can make meaning of things is the lens of a narrative or of a story. Okay, so in order for us to understand what's going on or to try and make meaning is we kind of put things into a story frame. You've probably been doing a lot of talking about that. There's probably been various versions of what a story or a narrative might be. In narrative practice, the version of, or the frame of a narrative has two landscapes. It's got a landscape of action, where it's the doing of life. It's the actions that are shaped according to a theme across time. Okay, so it's actions that are shaped according to a theme across time. And then it's the reflections on those actions, and that's the landscape of identity. Now, a story will be in both realms. They'll be in both realms, both landscape of action and the landscape of meaning. So let me give you perhaps just a clearer example of that. And I'm going to use examples from the world of therapy. Okay, so because I work as a therapist. Someone might have come to meet with me, and they might have told me that they're grappling with anxiety. And I might say something like, well, given how strong anxiety is, how is it that you made it to this appointment? They might respond by saying, look, I made sure I just didn't think about it. And I just somehow found myself in the waiting room. I just didn't think about it because I knew if I thought about it, anxiety would just talk me out of coming. Now, I might say, well, what do you call that? What would you call that? Because we're trying to get more of the preferred story, the one that's outside of anxiety. And the person might say, well, maybe it's something like, oh, I don't know, distraction. Okay, so we have an event where this person used distraction. Something tends to become a story when we can link that event with an action where distraction was taken in the past. Okay, so narrative therapy and stories are very much linked to history. Okay, so we have the startings of a preferred story, which is someone has skills in distraction to help them to take the power out of anxiety. To make it a story of distraction, we'd have to ask them about some time that they've done the same thing in the past. Okay, then it becomes an event that's linked according to a theme called distraction across time. Okay, and then we ask people to speak about what their meaning is of those actions. That's when stories get shaped. Okay, so that's a very, very rough account of what a story is in narrative practice. But it's not just, we understand stories are not just individualistic events. It's not just an individualistic thing that we're doing when we're shaping our identities. Our identities are socially shaped according to narrative practice. Okay, so it's the stories that get told about them and the stories that people tell about themselves or their family or their communities tell them. Okay, so I've already spoken a little bit about this second point of narrative practice, which is that people's lives are multi-storied. Even when we're meeting with someone and pretty much it seems all we can see is despair, all we can see is anxiety. If we're using an idea of narrative practice and the notion that probably comes from post-structuralist thought, that identity is complicated, it's historical, it's cultural, is we would see within it, identity is plural too, and it's contradictory. And so all of those contradictions to the story of despair can potentially be storied as well. Like with the example I shared with you before about someone grappling with anxiety by distracting themselves, this is a story that we could build on. Okay, so we understand that lives are multi-storied. This can be an incredibly helpful understanding when we get very convinced that all we are is just a bundle of nerves, or we're very wrong, or we're just violent, or whatever it might be, that this single story that we can get tempted to be talked into about ourselves. Okay, and then the third theme I'd like to just talk about or briefly mention with narrative practice is it is a determinedly non-pathologizing collection of ideas and practices. It's determinedly non-pathologizing. And to be honest, that was the thing that really drew me to it. So rather than the context of life being obscured, rather than what happens in life not being part of the conversation in the counselling or in conversations more generally, the context is the spotlight is put on it. So one of the, I suppose it's an aphorism of narrative practice, is the problem is the problem. The person, family, or the community is not the problem. Okay, there's many, many ways, if one is in the field of therapy or psychology or psychiatry, there's many, many ways that we can make people the problem. And we can do it unwittingly, and we can do it subtly. But the people that we're speaking with, who are often having hard times with life, pick up on those things often very quickly and very easily. Okay, so one thing that I hear a bit in the work that I'm doing is that someone's not very good for therapy because they're not psychologically minded. Okay, that's a kind of an understanding at times. They're not psychologically minded. Now, this understanding might be helpful sometimes for some therapists and community workers, may be helpful for individuals at times. But what it does is it pathologizes the person in a way. It says that they aren't able to participate in this thing called therapy, that they've got to change somehow. Narrative practice would be really interested in what it is, what skills, as the conversationalist, as the facilitator of the group, as the community worker, what skills we need to build on so that people can participate more. We just don't want to locate the problem in people. Another way that this happens in narrative practice is that there's this something called externalizing. Now, externalizing is when people are invited to think that the anxiety, that the despair, that the conflict, that alcohol, that addiction, whatever it is that they're grappling with, is not somehow located within their bodies, within their identities, but within their bodies. We invite people to think that they're in some kind of relationship to despair, anxiety, alcohol, addiction, etc. That they're in some kind of relationship to it. It's externalized. These problems are externalized. One of the exercises I do very regularly with young people in groups is I invite them to write letters to the problem. So people will say, "Dear despair, you came into my life when my parents separated. You do all of these things to it. You make me totally miserable. You isolate me from my friends, and I really don't like these things you're doing." And then I invite people to speak about what kind of relationship they would like with the problem, and then they write a little bit about what kind of relationship they'd like with the problem. Okay, so that's part of what it is to not pathologize, is to externalize the problem so people are in relationship to the problem. Now, I'm just wondering if anybody has a question or any thoughts at this point. You have to unmute yourself, I guess, and
so
Yeah, hello, David.
yeah.
Okay, you go, please.
Jyoti?
Yeah, so
I'll take two
David,
questions. Yeah, go on.
yeah, it's firstly wonderful. Again, getting back to narrative therapy, I have been trained by Shailaja Sen. I'm sure you know her.
Oh, Shelja, okay.
Yeah, so I've been
Terrific.
trained by her in narrative, and
Yeah.
I was wondering if, like, apart from establishing connection with the issues, is there any other way of externalizing writing? Like, one thing is writing or telling them, like you have mentioned in despair. Any other way which we can use during storytelling?
Story, yeah. So, I mean, it depends on what it is that kind of what metaphors or people can relate to, or analogies people can relate to. But quite often, especially if we're speaking with children, they'll write a letter to the worries, or they'll draw a drawing of worries, or they'll do a drawing of temper, or they'll do a drawing of fear. Okay, so that's another option. And if we could just think broadly about how we can do these things and how people might express themselves, not just in the spoken word. We can utilize creative pursuits. We can utilize the arts, and that has it has actually been linked away from my field, at least in Australia.
Thank you, David. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So, all right. Was there one other comment or one other question?
Yes, this is Pushkar. So,
Yeah.
David, as you mentioned about, some people are not therapeutically minded. So, I want to understand, like, how do you identify them and how do you process them further?
Look, when people are, in a way, they are, that kind of interpretation is made, one thing we can do is we can say, what's the norm that's supporting that criticism? Or what's the norm that's supporting that interpretation? Okay, so I think, and we can look at those norms and see them operate. I think when someone's called not therapeutically minded or not psychologically minded, they are sometimes they're not comfortable with the idea that you go and see a psychologist or see a therapist if you're having troubles. I think there's a norm, at least there's a norm in Australia. You almost have a moral obligation to see a therapist. This person might be refusing that norm. There might be also just not particularly interested in talking to a stranger about their lives.
Exactly.
They might be also very brief in their responses.
Okay.
So all of these things, but we don't want to pathologize these particular aspects of people. We don't want to impose norms on them. At least this is one way narrative therapy would understand it. Okay. I hope that's clarifying things a little bit. All right, I'll just get on to the next slide and we'll see where we get to. Now, this is a bit of a dry way of presenting things, and we'll get on to a couple of stories later. But this is just some of the, I guess, maxims or principles, practice principles and assumptions of narrative practice. We've looked at a couple of them. We've probably looked to some extent at the first one. People's identities are shaped through relationships, culture and history. So we understand when people are shaping their identities, in narrative practice, it's a cultural understanding or it's a post-structuralist understanding, okay? So whatever it is that's considered knowledge or even a truth or make this truth claim is located in history and culture and relationships. Okay, so if people, like to use that example earlier, if someone says, look, I've got skills in distraction, that's what's helped me get to this appointment and I've used it before. We don't assume that distraction is some kind of genetic expression. We don't assume it's that distraction is some kind of expression of their inner essence. Okay, we assume that distraction has been generated in culture, history, and relationships. So if we're having a conversation with someone, what we might do is we'd say, this distraction thing that you spoke of is a skill you use to take some of the power out of anxiety. Did you get introduced to it by anybody in your life? Did anybody donate that particular skill of distraction to your life? Can you think? Was it a treasured auntie, or was it, did you notice your mother doing that at times when life was tough for her? So we link people's identities through relationships. I've spoken a little bit about history. When else have you used the skill in distraction? And culture's the same. What have you noticed around you? Are there particular religious sayings that you've been relying on that help with distraction? Are there particular sayings in your community that help you with distraction? Okay, so we're trying to ask questions to build these stories. We understand some of the genesis of these preferred stories being relationships, culture, and history. Now, I just want to say, not holding an entitlement to know, people have been quite interested in this principle. I've spoken about it a little bit in narrative practice because sometimes I think that mental health workers and people in my field, and I include myself, we can feel like we have a right to know. Like we ask a question and really we ought to know what the answer is. But in narrative practice, we really want to be very respectful that people may not want to answer. And what that means is we might ask permission for the conversation. We might ask permission to ask another question even. We also might say something like, look, I have an idea for where this conversation could go, but we could go anywhere, you know, like we don't have to go down this particular route that I'm suggesting. We don't have to do what I'm kind of suggesting here. Okay, so we don't have an entitlement to know what people think. Narrative practice, it's a strongly ethical collection of ideas in narrative practice. Okay, stories are entwined with power relations and discourse. I'm sorry that these words are, sometimes they kind of loom as quite technical words at times, but I do really want to emphasize that narrative practice is interested in power relations and discourse. So look, I could give plenty of examples of power relations and how power is very, very present, not just in therapy. I think power is present in any conversation, in any relationship. And it's not about hoping it goes away. Often it's about trying to maneuver around it. So I think, for instance, I'll tell you a story, actually, a practice story. I was running a group. I asked people to think a little bit about what sort of action they take that makes a problem in their life just a little less persistent. Turns the volume down a little bit on a problem. Just a small action. It doesn't have to be triumphant. Just a small action. Is it going to their latest music playlist? Is it going outside of the house every day and finding a dog to pat? Is it finding the way to tell themselves that they're okay at times? Is it seeking out that friend that always makes them laugh? You know, what is it that they do? Just a small action. And then I asked a few other questions that I've already started to hint at, actually. You know, could you just say when you've used this particular practice and where do you think you might have got it from? This particular action? Did someone donate it to your life, etc.? And I asked them to write, I asked the group participants to write down their answers and we'd share them at the end. One person was just not writing anything, just staring into space. And I went up to him and I said, look, were those questions okay? Were they uncomfortable questions for you? And he said, he looked at me and he said, I don't do anything to make life better. I don't do anything. And I felt terrible. I felt terrible because my question had made him feel like he's taking even less action in his life than he might have already been tempted by, or at least that self-hatred might have been trying to talk him into. So I said, no, actually, I noticed that he was a person who, whenever he was on the unit, he would wear beanies. Now, beanies are a particular thing that people have in colder climates. So maybe lots of people in India don't know what a beanie is. Do you know what beanies are? No? So they're like a woolen hat that is kind of long and it comes down a bit low and they fit quite snugly on your head. And it's a way to keep your head warm. Often you'll wear them where it's a cold climate. You'll wear them if you're going skiing or something like that. And he was always wearing beanies. And I thought, oh, look, I wonder if that's something that speaks to action that he takes in life in dealing with the problem. I didn't know. I thought it was a bit playful because they were very, very bright beanies. He had quite a few different beanies that he wore. Mike Wazowski out of Monsters, Inc. I don't know if you know that movie, but there was that one with the eye out the front, up the top. And I said, what about these beanies that you wear? And he said, oh, no, I've been told not to wear those beanies. I've got to stop wearing them. And I said, well, when you wear those beanies, what effect does it have for you? What's it like? And he sort of stopped because he was feeling bad, and the question kind of caught his attention. And he said, actually, when I wear them, I guess I feel, I don't know, a little bit of comfort or something. I feel a bit comforted. And I said, well, I mean, I don't mean to take this too far too quickly, but do you think that you may well have skills in comfort? Skills in comforting yourself? And he said, yeah, maybe I do. Maybe I do. Okay, so we had a bit of a longer conversation, but now normally I might ask you what you see as the power there, and maybe discourse being taken for granted kind of norms often. Now the power, the taken for granted norm that might have been operating is that in order to be a proper person, in order to be conducting yourself correctly, legitimately perhaps, or normally, in the psychiatric unit, in the world more generally, you really shouldn't wear beanies. You should take them off. You shouldn't have them on all the time. Okay, so that's the norm. We could call that a discourse. It's a bit of a big word, but these taken for granted norms, that was the norm. If you want to be a proper person, a normal person, don't wear beanies full time. The power relations were, he was told within the treating team that he shouldn't wear beanies. Okay, so people with power told him he shouldn't wear beanies. You know, you really should start to wear them less if you want to get on in life. You know, so that's where the power is. So I was not interested in doing that. I was refusing these norms. I was not neutral in my power. Like, I had influence. I was in a position of power in this conversation, but I was not interested in introducing norms. So we then had a story that we could build, was that this young man had skills in comforting himself. Okay. All right. So this is just a very, very brief overview of narrative therapy. Okay.
Yeah,
so,
David, if Dave,
Go on.
please forgive me for interrupting.
Hi, Eric.
The session is approaching about halfway through, so it might be a good time to think about letting people do some activities so they can experience some of this.
Ah, yes. Okay. So, Eric, what have you done normally? Has it been like half talk, half activity? Is that the idea?
Well, I don't know. Just think in terms of guiding it towards. You're planning to put people in breakout rooms, right? To do something.
Yeah.
So just work towards that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I know you've been doing a lot of sitting, and so yeah, something a little. Oh, I don't know if you're going to stand up at points. Maybe you are. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'll break you into pairs, and if you could just jot down a couple of these questions and explore them with your pair. Okay. The first question is, actually, let me just say a bit more. I'm going to ask you a bit about how you've responded, or how you've kind of dealt with or coped with a difficult time. But I'm going to invite you not to treat the conversation like you're in a therapeutic kind of conversation. In other words, when you think of the difficult time and how you responded to it, if it's not difficult right now, would be better. If it's something in the past that was difficult and it's mostly retired, or mostly you're at ease with this experience. Okay, so if you could think of a difficult experience and how you've responded to it, how you dealt with it, how you cope with it. If you could jot that question down, think of a difficult experience, how did you cope or respond or deal with it? That's the first question. The second question is, if you could speak of that, if it's possible to speak of that action as a skill, what would you name that skill? Do you remember earlier, the person named it as skills in distraction? The story I just told, the person had skills in comforting himself. All right. Next question is, if you could say something about what your intentions are when you use that skill. What are your intentions when you use that skill? All right. And the last question is, can you evoke a story or think of a story or an event, story or event, I'm meaning them kind of interchangeably at this point, of where you have used that skill to powerful effect? Can you think of a story or an event where you've used that skill to powerful effect? And I'm going to ask you to do it two ways, and just one person to ask that question of the other, and then swap roles. Okay. And then do it the other way around. So I reckon it would be about, look, probably just, if we could do it in 15 minutes, if you don't get to the end of both interviews, that's fine. But should we just do 15 minutes? And Eric, would you be able to set that up now?
Yes.
Unless there are any questions.
Let's come out of the screen share. Good. Okay, so let me just say those questions again as I wrote them down. Number one, how did you cope with let's call it a challenging situation? There was some challenging situation. How have you coped with a challenging situation? Number two, what skill did you use to cope with that challenging situation?
Sorry, the second question is, if that, how you dealt with it could be called a skill, how would you name that skill?
Okay. Number three, what intention did you have as you used that skill? Obviously, the intention was to deal with a challenging situation, but you're asking for some elaboration on that. And then four is think of a specific incident when you use that skill. Yeah, but that's sort of the same thing as the first question, isn't it? How did you cope with a challenging situation?
The last question is often what, if we're building stories with people, often there's particular images. So if we can, and images can come through the particularities and the specifics of an event. If often people answer the first question by saying, oh, look, I just, you know, I kind of find ways to run or something. But once you speak in more specifics and particularities, people are able to build on mental images later, to draw on the story later. That's the intention of the fourth question. Okay, so it is it's a question that's distinct from it.
Good. I think people have enough to work with. And because some people have their camera off and may be away from their computer, I think we should put 3 people in each group.
Okay.
Okay. And you're saying they should stay in the group for how many? About 10, 12, 15 minutes?
Okay, well, let's make it 12 then.
Okay. Are people okay? Are people clear? If you don't want to, someone has said, I don't want to be in a room. So just leave the room because I'm gonna put everybody in rooms. But if you don't want to be in a room, just leave it and come and talk to me and David. That'll be fine. Okay.
Right.
Breakout rooms. Recreate. Okay, so we'll send them off.
Great.
Okay. Bye for now. Whoops. Yes. Okay, did they seem to be doing okay in there?
Yeah, I just went to one room there and exited.
Good.
Yeah, so Eric, I'm just going to go to the loo quickly and I'll
Go
be
ahead.
back. All right.
Pushkar, were you alone in the room there? You got to turn your mic on.
There were 3 people in the room, Anamika and David, but the camera is also off, and I tried, so no
That's
voice
fine.
also, so it's okay.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
We can even do it here. I'm trying to think of something I did well recently.
I also thinking like, no, this.
I can't say I've done this festival well yet because there's a lot that's still up in the air. For example, I think we're recording these sessions, but I don't know. I won't know until we leave the session. And I'm not planning to leave the session until some hours from now. So I cannot in good conscience say it's going well because I just don't know.
It's like in my life, if I say, like especially in my professional life, I deal with the biggest change when my boss change. Actually, I got a different boss, and it happens. I don't know. It happens more frequently than I see in the regular people. So every time I have to do this thing, like getting a relationship, building a relationship with my new boss every time, and every boss is different. His whole way of managing it different way. So what I do is before that I do just little bit of research, like how he used to do with the other people asking, and then I try to give him the same thing what he is looking for in his way. Okay, but it was like everybody has their own way, so I try to do like giving the same things, but anyway the organization goal is the same for everyone, but just giving it the thing in his way. For that the research I take, and yeah, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes I try to build but it doesn't work with that. And my intention is, if I say about my intention, so intention wise, yes, that's because it's my professional life. So first thing first, it's about me, that I want to be, I would say it's a kind of a little bit selfish, I believe, but I think it's okay to be there, because when you're doing work and you're getting paid for it, so it has to be good, obviously. And more intention is like, whenever I do, the goal of the organization should be met effectively. There should not be gap between me and my boss for this thing, like to not achieving the goal. So the last event, if I think about it, okay, one of the event maybe is almost maybe 6-8 months back happened. So there is a client, but I'm about to address, but my new boss and the client doesn't go along actually, because they have their own expertise and they both try to fight sometimes. It happens already the previous time. So I was like a little bit of dilemma, like how I'm going to deal with it. So because I have to make the client happy also, and I have to keep my boss also on the same page, that he support with me on that point. So what did I do? I tell to my boss that it's okay. You don't want to deal with him. You don't deal it. Let me deal, but don't question my judgment also. Like I may do something that's abstract or maybe something different. So you have to stay with me on that one. At least I can do that thing. And I don't know what will call it, this thing. What can I call? Maybe I cannot think of a word. It's not a persuasion. It's not a research. But maybe you can give me some word. What can we call it actually? There is some word or maybe something. If you...
Were you and Eric having a conversation?
Well,
I don't mean to barge into your conversation. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just asking, okay, the thing I was telling, like, the things which happens with me. So there is a client with me and my boss, they don't go along with actually. So what I do sometimes to tell my boss, okay, let me deal with the client, and I may do something abstract or something different, which you may not like, but the final goal is, okay, client will be happy. So you have to stay with me on this one. So that's what the thing I do. I tell him. So what we can call it? I'm not finding the word.
Yes.
Can call it actually.
Meanwhile, Eric, the two people in my breakout room, they never showed up. There was one name reflecting as Poonam and the other as Yunsuk. So that's how I just came back to the main room. So
that's fine. That's fine.
Same here.
Oh,
yeah, same here as well.
Hi, Anamika. How are you?
Hi.
Anamika, you were in my room. I was there actually.
Oh, okay. I had got a call, so I think it disconnected me from Zoom.
Okay.
And then when I came back, then there was no one. There was just David and me. And then I kept saying hello, 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 but I got no reply. So
I
then
left early,
I
I
did.
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, what might we call it, huh? I mean, I won't talk about it this time, but the language we use to describe our experience can be just so very, very important. I'm not sure if this is an example of that. It may be, but I know some people like to call them die thoughts rather than suicidal thoughts for very, very good reason, for instance, or battle scars rather than cutting or something, like people get very, very particular about how they speak about these things. I don't know what might be resonant for you in your community. In Australia, we might call that being a middle person or being a peacemaker or kind of, I don't know. I'm not sure how we would describe that action. That's the.
Okay.
What's your guess about how you might describe that?
It's like I can generate the word what you said. It's like about middleman. So that's what I was also talking with Eric also. Persuasion is kind of close to that, not exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe the peacemaker. I think it would be the right choice. Yes, peacemaker. We can say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's something about how you might do things that your boss may not approve of. Is that
Yes,
right?
obviously.
And with the intention of just making it better, making things flow better.
Because the intention is finally, yes, the client must be happy, because client should get what he wants, even though what his behavior is, we don't care about that, but that the organization goal should be met. That's my intention is, yes. So
that gives me an image of I don't know what others here would say, but an image of someone who's well, creative or resourceful, but maybe even a little bit defiant, perhaps. I'm not sure. I don't know if any of those words resonate, but yeah, so.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult position to be in, because you have to make sure that both are happy with your decision. And at the same time, you have to be happy with your decision as well.
That's what we were talking about only. It's like what I do in this situation when my boss and client doesn't go along. So I just tell my boss, okay, you have to stay with me. Let me do whatever I do. It might be abstract, it might be different, you might not like, but the end result, I'm sure it will be okay. So just, so I keep my boss on my side first, and then I do with the client to do whatever to do him happy or to get his work. So that's the thing what we call peacemaker. Yes, is very close to it, that the word, but okay, that's what is can think about.
David, can in this case we call it a skill of being result oriented? Because ultimately what he's saying in his story is ultimately it's to get the client happy and get the business going. So if there is anything like, so when we kind of diversify the skills, like you said, skill of comforting yourself, or skill of distraction. So if we could say skill of being result oriented, or skill of being have skill of resolution or whatever, because what came out from the story was this, that like what Pushkar said from his personal stories, that ultimate goal is to make the client happy. So don't judge me, I'll do it in my way.
Yeah. I think sometimes skill and intention, as also what one values, they can be slightly distinct realms of the landscape of meaning for stories. If you're inviting people to reflect on actions in their life to build a story, they can be a bit distinct. A skill. So that's why the question, can you speak of an intention, can be quite a useful question, because if people are having a rough time, they may be pretty reticent to say, I have a skill, I have a life skill. And we don't want to impose that on people. We don't want to say, no, you do, because people can get alienated and they can feel that this is an act of power. Okay, so so we can ask, what's your intention when you didn't think about the therapy before you came to it? What was your intention? Then that question can be a bit easier to answer than what was the skill you had. But in answering your first question, Sonia, I suppose with a very careful and serious kind of commitment to power and attending to power and doing these conversations collaboratively, we would suggest words, but hopefully the words we suggest to describe action we've heard in the conversation somewhat. So results-oriented may be a very good question, maybe a good description, and may really fit for Pushkar. But we might just hover around a little bit more. Like if Pushkar and I were having a bit of a chat, maybe a therapeutic conversation, I might ask him a bit more, any kind of words to describe that. Do you have anything? And he might come up with other words. If he doesn't, I could say, it sounds like results oriented is what's going on here. Does that? And I wouldn't want to impose it.
Yes.
I'm talking about therapeutic practice here. I don't mean for this to be relevant to all storytelling. But yeah, we wouldn't impose it. We'd say, is that a word that fits for you? Sorry, go on.
Is the point of this to just raise awareness in people of the abilities they have?
Yeah, so one of the assumptions, I haven't quite got onto it yet, about narrative practice is, and it's not the only therapeutic practice that does this, but it really engages with this as a core idea of it, is that people are always responding, and in those responses, they're developing skills and they're developing knowledge about how to deal with difficulties. And part of what we're doing is very delicate work of making those skills and knowledges more available and more visible to them. Yes, so that's right.
And I think I recall seeing that, reading that in narrative therapy, you also pay attention to where the client got those skills from.
Yes.
If they learned it from, you know, parents or grandparents, if they're modeling after somebody. So
Yes.
it's part of being aware and celebrating the you know, what one has picked up from past generations.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, and in that way, narrative therapy is like, does set itself in reaction to or in response to an alienating kind of or an isolating kind of psychology, potentially isolating psychology. It's trying to build connections. It's trying to honor relationships and the place that relationships have in people's lives. Join
Okay,
people.
I think we're approaching the time when we should call people back.
Yeah.
Yes? As it, I think it's been at 12 minutes approximately.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll give them a 1 minute warning.
Great.
Hi, David, this is Lena. I have a question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fourth question, can you invoke a story or event where you use that skill to pass or fail? I understand the question, but I wasn't able to do anything in that. So
That's fine. That's fine.
I'm not sure what is expected in that. So should I create a totally different story, or that story should be some other event in my own life?
If you already told, like Eric was suggesting that the fourth question is quite similar to the first, I know what Eric meant by that, but with the fourth question, I was just trying to get a bit more particularities, a bit more description to an event where you've used this skill or this intention. And the intention behind that, or the work that that question does, as I was saying before, is it's more likely for that story to endure. Okay, people are more likely to be able to draw on a story when they have mental pictures, mental images. When you tend to say, look, one way I deal with despair is by, you know, doing self-care or something, that's often too vague for people to draw on as a story later on. The particularities of action is what will help a story endure. So that was the intention of that fourth question, Lena.
Okay. Okay, but the questions in themselves, they are very good questions. I have done it for only one episode that came to my mind, but I plan to do it for more episodes, and hopefully the last question, I really don't think it is same. Maybe, for different situation that I try, something will come up. I'm just feeling, but the questions are really helpful, and I really want to thank you for them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So this is what I've learned in the world of narrative therapy. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So
Here they come.
Here comes everyone.
Okay, now everyone, do be aware that the session is being recorded, and parts of it might be put on YouTube. So only share what what is appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Look,
that's a bit late, Eric. You've already you told us after the fact.
Yeah, I thought you
said the breakout rooms were not going to be shared.
Yeah.
The breakout rooms were not recorded.
They're not shared.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay, that's fine.
Yes.
The breakup room, something very personal we shared.
That's right. But naturally, after people go into breakout rooms, we generally in a workshop, we do ask for, does anyone want to share anything that they talked about in the breakout room?
Okay. That is okay.
Yeah, so does anyone want to share anything?
Yeah, maybe I will share how I deal with the problems which I face. There are two kind of problems in my life. Ones which I can share, ones we cannot share to anyone. So those problems which I cannot share because it relates to my loved ones and I don't want to give up on them. And I know that someday all will be okay. So those kind of problems gives me more stress. So what I do is I distract myself. I try to shut off myself because I cannot run away from them to some other way. I have to continue to live. So what I do is like laptop, like I go into a movie. I for the 2 hours I go into a movie and enjoy myself and come back to the problem. So I am back with more energy and more vitality to face my problem, which is not going to vanish. So this is one thing which I use, and I do with the intention to shut off myself. And the skill which I need is obviously I need to cut off. I should know how to make two worlds. One a make believe fake world where I can go into it and come back momentarily and go in and come back. I do that.
Fantastic, thank you. Shyama, is that how you pronounce your name?
Shyama.
Shyama, sorry, Shyama. Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. I just wanted to say that if we're interested in some of these ideas, the more we practice these ideas, the more we can just notice those particular aspects of life that are outside of the problem story, or that speak to certain skills or understandings that people have. You said three things, or at least maybe two things, that we could build into more stories, other stories perhaps. One of them is, it will be okay. There's one of those problems I don't share, but you said, I know it will be okay.
Yes.
Right. So in narrative practice, we wouldn't say that's some sort of intuition you have. We wouldn't understand that as some kind of magical knowing. We would understand that knowing that it'll be okay is based on your lived experience. And we could ask for that. How do you know it will be okay? Where did you get that sense? We might ask those questions to build more story around that. The second thing you said is, I know it's not going to vanish. Now, I meet with, when I meet with people in therapy and they say, everything's fixed, we don't need to speak anymore. I'm happy that people might not want to speak anymore, that's good. But when people say that everything's fixed and it's, I'm moving on now from the problem, it can make me nervous, because I don't think, I think that life sometimes doesn't work that way, and mostly problems make comebacks.
Yes.
Mostly problem experiences make comebacks, but we can build for it, we can prepare for it. So when you say it's not going to vanish, I think that can be extremely helpful knowledge, or even wisdoms or realizations you might have collected over the years. What you do with that. Sorry, go on, Shyama.
Acceptance. We have to practice acceptance.
Right.
Accepting situations. Yes,
Yeah.
this is good. I won't be able to change anyone's core nature, or neither can I change certain things which are going to be. I can't change my mother. I can't change my father. I can't change so many things. The relationships will be there. So what I can do is accept them as they are, because they are so old. I can't expect miracles, and I have to be a dutiful daughter. I can't ignore them or tell them get out. I have to take care. I have to do everything. So for that acceptance, I practice, and I practice distraction also.
Okay. Yeah. So so we could keep the conversation going. I hope you got a bit of a sense of that. It's these conversations, hopefully the more we hear, the more story we can get when we build skills around getting more stories from people's skills, from people's intentions, people's purposes, and the history of people's lives, etc. Okay, maybe one more comment, and then I'm just going to say a little bit more, and then we'll have 5 minutes at the end for some general conversation.
So I I would like to just share one insight that while discussing with my partner in the breakout room, I realized that basically it's building a space between whatever you're facing. It's either despair or anxiety. It's like we're so close to it. So by doing this narrative practice, there is some space now, and you're
Yeah.
getting some space. So that is what I understood is, and all these skills are helping you to get that space, and also then you are broadening your perspective. Otherwise you're so attached to whatever you are facing, and you're drowned in that. And so that's why all these skills, they, if you keep practicing them, they help to build that, they help you to kind of detach a little bit from your problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the metaphor of space can be extremely helpful. And I think sometimes when we do get a sense of stepping away from somehow conversationally or linguistically getting some space from the words or from experience, the more we can know that experience actually. And the more we can know, for instance, problem stories. But can I also suggest that one of the things, say the letters to the problem that I spoke about earlier, one of the things that it does is that people are freed up to get angry, not at themselves. I don't know if you folks get angry at yourself. I know I can get angry at myself. When we meet with people and they've been, visited the mental health system and know something about how hard life can get, often what can accompany that is, these waves of self-hatred, these sort of virtual kind of avalanches of self-loathing that can knock people off their feet for all sorts of reasons, especially if people have been at the receiving end of abuse. But when people get some space from, or they know they're in a relationship to a problem that's out there, they start to have a problem with the problem, not with themselves. They have a problem with a problem. And that's often very relieving for me as a group facilitator when I see the young people, I hope you don't mind me swearing, but they say, I hope you don't mind, but they say fuck off to the problem, whereas they've been telling themselves the same thing for the last 2 years. They want themselves to fuck off. But so it's really people are able to express quite a different relationship to that problem experience that's not shaped so much by self-hatred. Okay, now should I just go back to a couple more ideas? We don't have all that much longer, or would you like to have it as a bit of a open discussion? Consulting a group is often not a great idea. People have really different ideas, but I'm going to make a decision. I'm just going to look at a couple more points on the PowerPoint. We won't, obviously not going to go through much more, and then we'll have a discussion towards the end. We'll leave about 5 minutes. Eric, is that enough? Or
yes, well, we have about 15 minutes, not even 15. We have about 10 minutes to go.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Now this is the next point there. If you could see, it's point 4. People and those in our networks have the skills and knowledges to address their concerns or problem stories. Okay. Now, hopefully you've got a little bit of a sense of that. Now, narrative practice is very much about putting the spotlight on agency and how people respond. And the assumption is people are always responding to whatever they're grappling with that's in front of them in life, including trauma. People are always responding to trauma. And in those responses, people are generating skills and knowledges. One of the things that can often happen in a group is I might say to them, to the young folks in the psychiatric unit, hey, what's something that you do in order to deal with the despair? What's something that you do? And fairly often people will say, "What do you want me to say the really bad stuff as well as the good stuff?" And I say, absolutely. Yeah, you can say the bad stuff too. And then people speak about self-harm. They speak about drinking alcohol daily, or they speak about driving a car incredibly dangerously, or whatever it is that can bring extra complications to life. But we're interested in those things. We're interested in those actions too. I mean, things like going to the movies and some other things that some of Shiana, you were speaking about, and other people was, one other person was speaking about too, are very relevant. We build those stories, but we also want to build the stories of what people have been doing that can bring extra complications, because we want to honor the actual intentions that people have. Okay, so and sometimes people will know that actually, really, when I just lock myself in my room in order to deal with stress, I know it becomes a problem after 3 days. Okay, so people will say that they'll say, I know it's a problem after 3 days. And that's when we can say, oh, that speaks to a particular knowledge that you've generated in your life. How do you know that it's a problem after 3 days? Like, how do you know, for instance, that I was going to ask Shiana, or we could speak about it, how will you know that it will be okay? So when people speak about those things, they have a sense of, we understand those as life wisdoms or realizations or knowledges that they've created or they've built or cultivated. Okay, so the next point, there seems to be some people I'm not able to let in. Eric, is that? I don't know. Anyway, people speak for themselves rather than be spoken for or about themselves. Okay, so it's the narrative practice is a particular approach to therapy and community work that's very, very strongly engages in ethics, engages in one's relationship to oneself as a therapist, and ethical behavior. Okay, so one of those things that was happening in the field is that that narrative therapy kind of was responding to, is that people would be constantly spoken about. You know, there'd be ward rounds, and the person who was suffering would be the last person to speak, or they would be spoken about by health professionals. So we want to structure the work structure this work so that people speak for themselves. Okay, it's a very strongly ethical position. Now, we could talk about any of these things for days, I'd say, and I'd be really interested in a lot of your questions and engagements with these ideas. We've spoken already about the next one, people's lives are multi-storied. This is a key understanding. So even if we're finding someone, I often do meet with people who have perpetrated violence, and quite often, if a man has been referred to me and he has been referred for his perpetration of violence, he will assume that I will understand him as a violent man. You know, that there'll be this totalized single-story description of him. So often I will say, in those instances where someone's meeting with me and they've been using violence, I'll say, look, I assume that's not all that there is to you, and we're going to work hard at locating those honourable, those respectful stories of your life. Those times when you have taken responsibility for the harm you've created. I assume they have been there, and we'll be looking for them. But as an idea, I always draw on this idea, because I don't know how it is for you sometimes, and if you meet with people who have been, in the grips of dreadful, dreadful, thick sorrow, they have a sense that life is stuck, they're going nowhere, there's no action they can take. It can be very captivating of us too, as a conversational partner, as a storytelling partner. So if I'm able to bring this principle to such an exchange, there's more to this person. There's always going to be another story. We're going to find it. It helps me not get so captivated by a thick sorrow, because that can be very catching. Okay, so that particular principle, people's lives are multi-storied, is I find extremely useful in the times when people's sorrow is very captivating for everyone. Okay, and the final one is it's a collection. Narrative therapy is a collection of ideas that support diversity. So there is something in our field, or my field, in Australia, where there's this idea that there's what we need to do is reproduce evidence-based practice. So now I'm not against evidence-based practice, but narrative therapy would be a little bit at odds with that. Okay, as you're probably getting a bit of a sense of, narrative therapy is about trying to do the delicate work of looking at the idiosyncratic ways people are responding and dealing with life's difficulties and building stories out of that. Okay, so I told you the example where the woman said to me, this young woman in a group out of the blue said, I know how to deal with my depression. I find a dog to pat every day, get out of the house and find a dog to pat. Those are the stories, those are sort of events that we're very, very interested in listening carefully for, reflecting them back in a conversation, and often writing them down and putting them in a therapeutic letter. Or a picture that we might try and evoke as well. We're interested in presenting and supporting diversity, all the diverse ways that people are responding. Now, mindfulness is a very big one at the moment, as is distress tolerance in Australia. And I'm not against either of those as, for ways that people might be responding to difficulties. But I think they are, they would be me importing a solution rather than doing the delicate work of helping people find what they've already done. Okay. Now, there's a whole lot more that we could say about all of this, but I'm just going to pause it there, and we'll have a bit of a discussion for the last 5 minutes. And I'd be interested in any aspect of what I've spoken about so far.
Yes. Well, what I'm hearing is that narrative therapy really focuses on the client's experiences and seeks to raise awareness about the experiences and frame and reframe what the client has experienced. From what I'm hearing, there doesn't seem to be much working with fantasy involved. What I'm thinking about is a couple hours ago, we had a presentation from another Australian, and actually another person near Sydney, Susan Perrow. Her whole approach is working with the client to create a fantasy metaphorical story, which somehow works on the unconscious and points the way to healthy development. So am I right in thinking narrative therapy does not really involve working with metaphor and fantasy?
Absolutely works with metaphor.
Oh.
Fantasy is a slightly awkward word, perhaps, in and conceptually for narrative practice. Narrative practice, as I was saying a bit before, it is post-structural. So these kind of understandings, these psychological kind of mechanisms and understandings are not understood as truths. They're understood as moments in time and cultural products. So something like the unconscious does not fit well within a post-structural understanding in a way, and it does not fit well within narrative practice. Now, fantasy is something that has come kind of a little bit out of psychoanalytic understandings.
But in
metaphor,
what way?
Metaphor for sure. Yeah.
In what way do you work with metaphor?
So metaphor is, I mean, part of it is just always listening for metaphor. I know in my culture, we speak a little less metaphorically. But we're always on the lookout for metaphor and what people are using, you know, like I feel like that I'm just in a boat and I'm constantly barraged with storms. You know, people often speak of storms when they speak of mental health experience, actually. And we would use that, you know, tell me a little bit about the storm. what have you done to batten down the hatches? Or what have you done to, where are some of your safe port of calls? And who are the people that might make up your safe port of calls, etc. So we might work with metaphor in that way when people are using it. There's a whole lot of collective narrative practice that's been gaining momentum over the last 10 years, where metaphors are introduced into the work. It started with the metaphor of the tree of life. The tree is taken up as a metaphor for all the different aspects of identity formation and the assumptions in a narrative approach that I've been speaking a little bit about. There's also the kite of life, there's the team of life, there's recipes of life. And, you know, like recipes of life I often do with people, you know, like if you could say that, you know, there's particular ingredients for what it is that can make a recipe that for happiness, what are those ingredients, you know, etc. So
wonderful.
so
Let's call. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
go on, Eric. Did you?
Yeah, let's call on Joe Stanley, and then
Joe
we have
Stanley?
to finish. Our time is up. But David Newman's contact information is on the Chennai Storytelling Festival 2021 presenters page, so you can easily follow up with him. Joe Stanley, what did you want to say?
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and thank you, Eric. I was going to ask you about the lady with who pats dogs. Would you ask her what the dog patting was a metaphor for? Would you actually ask her to tell you about how she uses the dog patting as a metaphor, or would you just ask her more about what it feels like to pat the dog, and does she have a particular favorite kind of dog to pat?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have that conversation with her at the time. We had a brief conversation. It was in the middle of a group, but my guess is it's not so much metaphoric. It's a literal action, and if she spoke a little bit about, you know, it feels like I'm at one with nature or something, or kind of. There's ways that I might hear her speak metaphorically or lyrically, but but yes, the question, when you pat a dog, what effect does it have for you, would be the question I would ask next. How does that shape your life? What does it do? Yeah, that's the question I'd ask next.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, David Newman. You've obviously, your field is an entire world, and you've given us a glimpse of it today. So thank you very much for that. And we have to go on now to a sequence of actual storytelling.
No worries. Look, thank you very much, Eric, and I really appreciate all the work you've done and all the questions and interests you shared. Bye, folks.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And hopefully the recording was made, and I'll be in touch with you about that.
Okay.
Great.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye,
thank you. Okay. Seamlessly, we are shifting from a rather cognitive mode to storytelling mode. And Ramya Srinidhi, are you here?
Yes, Eric. Hi, I'm here.